June 7, 1945, a U.S. military convoy rumbled through the gates of a prisoner-of-war facility in Honolulu, Hawaii, carrying cargo that would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about each other. Inside the canvas-covered transport sat 25 Japanese women, auxiliary soldiers, medics, and clerks captured during the Allied island-hopping campaign through the Pacific. They were exhausted, terrified, and completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. As the truck came to a halt in the central compound, the humid air thick with tension, the canvas covering was pulled back, revealing the women to their American guards. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become a story told and retold across decades, a moment of profound collision between propaganda and reality that would ultimately transform both prisoners and guards alike. Before we discover what made these women laugh in the face of their deepest fears, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 23-year-old Keiko Tanaka sat near the back of the truck, clutching a small bag that contained everything she still owned. She had served as a medical clerk on Okinawa, believing every word of the imperial propaganda about defending the homeland from barbaric American devils. She had been told that black American soldiers were subhuman monsters, brutal, undisciplined beasts without honor or restraint. She had been told that capture by these men would mean torture, humiliation, perhaps death. As she prepared to step down from the truck, her hands trembling, she braced herself for the nightmare she'd been promised. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat, her eyes widening in genuine shock. Standing in formation before the truck were the American guards assigned to oversee the women prisoners. At the front stood Sergeant Elijah Carter, a former dock worker from Oakland who stood 6'3" tall with the broad shoulders of a man who'd loaded ships since he was 16. Next to him was Private Marcus Johnson from Georgia, 6'2", built like the oak trees from his family's land. Corporal David Hayes from Chicago looked like he could carry 2 men on his back without breaking stride. The entire row of guards towered over anything Keiko or her fellow prisoners had imagined. These weren't the twisted monsters from the propaganda posters. These were men, tall, disciplined, standing with quiet dignity in their perfectly pressed uniforms. Their faces weren't cruel. They weren't leering or threatening. They were just waiting. Behind Keiko, 20-year-old Yuki Matsumoto whispered in Japanese, her voice trembling with nervous energy. "They're enormous. The propaganda never showed us this." Several other women murmured their agreement, fear mixing with confusion and something that might have been the first hairline crack in their indoctrination. If the Empire had lied about something this obvious, this impossible to hide, what else had been a lie? But it was 19-year-old Sachiko Ito who broke the tension in the most unexpected way. Speaking in quiet Japanese, she said something that would change the entire dynamic of what was supposed to be a grim prison reception. "I thought Americans, especially black ones, were supposed to be small and weak," Sachiko whispered, her eyes fixed on Sergeant Carter. "They're a lot bigger than our men." Despite their terror, several women let out small, nervous laughs. The absurdity of the situation, the complete contradiction between what they had been told and what stood before them, was too much to process without some release of tension. The laughter was their first act of rebellion against everything they had been taught, a tiny crack in the wall of lies that had shaped their entire understanding of the world. One of the guards, Private Johnson, glanced at Sergeant Carter with a slight smile, not understanding the words, but recognizing the sound of nervous laughter anywhere. Carter's expression remained professional, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps understanding. Perhaps patience. Perhaps the recognition that these frightened women were not the enemy he'd imagined either. The morning of June 8th brought the women their first full day of camp routine, and with it more opportunities to observe the men who now controlled every aspect of their lives. The next morning, Sergeant Carter led the women to the mess hall with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown the day before. The building was simple: wooden walls, long tables, the smell of something cooking that made Keiko's empty stomach clench with both hunger and suspicion. What greeted them inside made every woman stop in her tracks. The tables were laden with food. Not the meager rations they'd survived on during the last months of the war. Not the watery soup and handful of rice they'd expected from a prison camp. Real food, scrambled eggs, piles of them, fresh bread, bowls of fruit, coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not burnt grain. Yuki leaned close to Keiko, whispering in Japanese, "This must be a trick, to make us soft before interrogation." "Or maybe," Sachiko murmured from behind them, her eyes following Private Johnson as he casually loaded his own plate with what looked like enough food to feed 3 men. Maybe the propaganda lied about this too. The women ate slowly, cautiously, unable to fully trust the abundance. But as they watched the guards eat, truly eat, with the relaxed ease of men who knew this was normal, the cognitive dissonance deepened. "Look at that once," Sachiko whispered, nodding toward Corporal Hayes, who was on his 3rd helping of eggs. "He eats like he's preparing for battle. Does he think the food will run away?" Several women stifled giggles. "The tall one, Sergeant Carter. He's so polite even when eating," Yuki observed. "He chews like he's in church. Our officers used to eat like dogs at a feast." "Maybe that's why they need to be so big," Keiko added, finally allowing herself a small smile. "To hold all that food." The laughter was quiet but genuine this time, less nervous than the day before. Across the mess hall, Private Johnson nudged Sergeant Carter. "Sir, they keep looking at us and whispering. You think they're planning something?" Carter glanced over at the women, who immediately looked down at their plates, trying to appear innocent. He noticed their barely suppressed smiles, the way their shoulders shook with contained laughter. "Johnson," he said calmly, "I think they're just surprised we don't eat our prisoners." "Should we be worried, Sergeant?" Carter watched Keiko sneak another piece of bread into her pocket, her movements furtive but hopeful. He remembered that same hunger, that same disbelief at abundance from his own childhood. "No, Private," he said quietly. "I think they're just learning we're not the monsters they were promised." By the 3rd day, the initial shock had given way to something more unsettling: routine observation. The women had stopped flinching when the guards approached. They'd stopped expecting cruelty that never came. And in the mess hall, they'd started truly paying attention. Keiko sat with her tray: scrambled eggs, 2 pieces of toast, fresh oranges, and a portion of rice that seemed almost abinin in its generosity. She stared at it like an equation that didn't balance. "I've been counting," Yuki whispered, leaning across the table. "They serve us 3 full meals every day, with meat and fruit." "I noticed the rice," another woman, Michiko, added quietly. "It's white rice, not the brown scraps we got on Okinawa, not even mixed with barley." Sachiko's eyes tracked Sergeant Carter as he passed their table, his own tray loaded with food. "Even our officers never ate this well. Remember Lieutenant Nakamura? He would take the best rations and still complain they weren't enough." "And Colonel Sato," Keiko said, her voice dropping. "He ate while his men starved, called it leadership privilege." The women fell silent, the weight of that comparison settling over them. Then Sachiko, watching Corporal Hayes share an orange with Private Johnson, added, "These men, they eat the same food we do. I've watched. The guards don't take better portions." "Maybe they're just better liars," Michiko offered, but her tone lacked conviction. "Or maybe," Yuki said slowly, "maybe we were told lies about who the real savages were." The laughter that followed was different from before. Warmer, tinged with something like relief. And underneath it, the first stirrings of shame. Across the hall, Private Johnson noticed the change. The women's posture had relaxed. Their laughter wasn't the high, nervous sound from that first day. It was human. "They're smiling more, Sergeant," he observed to Carter. Carter nodded, carefully neutral. "They're realizing they're safe." "Think they'll stop seeing us as monsters?" Carter was quiet for a moment, watching Keiko gesture animatedly to her companions, apparently telling a story that made them all laugh. "I think they already have, Johnson. Now they're just trying to figure out why they ever did in the first place." "That's good, right?" "It's progress," Carter said, "but it's also painful. Realizing you've been lied to about everything you thought you knew." He stood, picking up his tray. "We just keep showing them who we really are. The rest is up to them." As he walked past the women's table, Keiko looked up and caught his eye. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. No hatred, no fear. Just two people trying to understand how they'd ended up on opposite sides of a war neither had truly chosen. She bowed her head slightly. Carter nodded back and continued on. Small gestures. But in a prison camp built on propaganda and lies, small gestures were revolutionary. The laundry detail became an unexpected classroom. Keiko had been assigned to wash uniforms alongside Yuki and Sachiko, working under the supervision of Private Johnson. He stood nearby, not hovering, just present, watching them work with the large wash basins in the humid afternoon heat. "Hot," Keiko said in careful English, wiping her forehead. Johnson looked up, surprised. "Yeah, hot," he agreed, nodding. "Very hot," Yuki added, testing the words. "Very, very hot," Sachiko chimed in, and all three women giggled at their own boldness. Johnson grinned. "Y'all trying to learn English now?" They stared at him blankly. He pointed to himself. "Johnson!" Then to the sun. "Hot!" Then made an exaggerated wiping motion across his brow. "Very hot." Understanding dawned. They nodded eagerly. He held up a clean shirt. "When I give you something," he handed it to Keiko, "you say, 'Thank you.'" "Sankyu?" Keiko tried, butchering the pronunciation. "Tank? You?" Yuki attempted. Johnson's face split into a wide smile. "Close enough. Thank you." "Thank you," Sachiko declared triumphantly. "That's it." Johnson laughed. Then he attempted Japanese, his Georgia drawl mangling the sounds. "Arigato?" The women burst into genuine laughter, not at him, but with him. His pronunciation was worse than theirs. "Arigato," Keiko corrected gently, then repeated, "Arigato." "Arigato," Johnson tried again, better this time. "Good! Good!" Yuki clapped. Corporal Hayes walked by, shaking his head with amusement. "Johnson, you starting a language school?" "Just being neighborly, Corporal." As the afternoon wore on, words passed back and forth, mispronounced, laughed over. Tried again. Water. Soap. Clean. Mitsu. Seken. Kirei. By the time Sergeant Carter came to check on the detail, he found his guards and their prisoners working side by side, teaching each other words neither needed for the task at hand, but both wanted to share. Language barriers, he thought, only exist when you stop trying to speak. It was Yuki who asked the question that changed everything. During an evening roll call, with the camp interpreter present, she spoke quietly. "Why do you fight? For a country that, we heard, doesn't treat you as equal?" The interpreter hesitated before translating. Sergeant Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Translate it," he told the interpreter. Then, choosing his words carefully, "It's true. Back home, I can't eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers. Can't use the same water fountains. My people have been fighting for dignity since we were brought to America in chains." The interpreter's voice was steady as he relayed the words in Japanese. The women stared, uncomprehending. "Then why?" Keiko asked, her voice breaking. "Why fight for them? Why show us kindness when your own country shows you none?" Carter was quiet for a long moment. Because fighting back home doesn't mean I stop fighting for what's right here. Because if I become the monster they say I am, then they win. He paused. And because maybe, just maybe, if we prove our humanity enough times, in enough places, eventually, they'll have to see it. We were told you were beasts, Sachiko whispered, tears streaming down her face. That you had no honor, no discipline. I know what you were told, Carter said gently. They lied to us about everything, Yuki said, her voice hollow. You are stronger than any of our men, Keiko said suddenly, looking directly at Carter. The interpreter translated, and she continued, because you fight with kindness, even when the world gives you every reason not to. Carter's eyes glistened, but he maintained his composure. That's not strength, ma'am. That's just refusing to let hate win. But as the women filed back to their barracks in silence, they understood. They'd been taught to worship power while these men embodied something far greater, dignity in the face of injustice. True strength, they realized, had nothing to do with brutality, and everything to do with choosing humanity when you had every right to choose otherwise. August 6th arrived with news that shattered what remained of the women's world. The camp commander delivered it through the interpreter, his voice clinical. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. Casualties in the tens of thousands. The city, gone. The women sat in stunned silence in the rec room, unable to process the scale. Keiko thought of her aunt, who lived near Hiroshima. Yuki's cousin had been stationed there. Sachiko simply stared at the floor, her face blank with shock. They waited for it. The jeering, the mockery, the victorious celebration they'd been taught to expect from their captors. After all, wasn't this what happened when your enemy suffered? Hadn't their own officers laughed at news of Allied losses? Instead, Sergeant Carter entered the room and simply said, "I'm sorry for your losses." The interpreter translated. The women looked up, disbelieving. Private Johnson appeared with extra rations, not as a taunt, but placed gently on the table. "Thought y'all might need this," he said quietly before leaving. Corporal Hayes stood guard outside but turned his back, giving them privacy for their grief. No gloating, no celebration, just respect. Keiko began to cry, not just for Hiroshima, but for everything. For the lies, for the war, for the realization that these men she'd been taught to hate had more compassion than her own leaders ever had. "They're mourning with us," Yuki whispered, watching Carter's retreating figure. "Why would they mourn with us?" "Because they know what it means to lose," Sachiko said softly. "They've been losing their whole lives, and they still chose kindness." That night, the guards kept their distance but remained watchful, not as jailers, but as silent witnesses to grief. They didn't intrude. They didn't lecture. They simply let the women be human in their sorrow. And in that space between enemy and empathy, something fundamental shifted. The war wasn't over, but for these 25 women, the propaganda finally was. 3 days after Hiroshima, as the sun set over the Pacific, Keiko began to sing. She didn't plan it. The melody simply rose from somewhere deep inside. A lullaby her grandmother had sung, Takeda no Komoriuta, a song about longing and home and the ache of distance. Her voice was soft at first, almost apologetic. But then Yuki joined in, her alto weaving beneath Keiko's melody. Then Sachiko, then Michiko. One by one, the women's voices braided together in the evening air, singing not for performance, but for survival, for something to hold on to when everything else had been taken away. The guards, positioned around the perimeter, stopped their patrol. Private Johnson stood frozen, his hand resting on the fence post. The melody was foreign, the words unknown, but the emotion was universal. Grief, hope, the stubborn refusal to let beauty die even in the ugliest circumstances. When the last note faded, Silence held the camp for a long moment. Then, from near the gate, Corporal Hayes began to sing. His voice was deep and rich, carrying across the compound. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Private Johnson joined in, his Georgia drawl adding texture to the harmony. Then others, voices from men who'd grown up in churches across the South, who knew what it meant to sing your survival, to wrap pain in melody, and offer it up as prayer. The Japanese women stood transfixed. They didn't understand the English words, but they understood this, the soul-deep ache of a people who'd suffered, who'd been told they were less than human, and who sang anyway. Who sang because of it. "Swing low, sweet chariot." As the hymn echoed through the camp, Keiko realized she was crying. Not from sadness, but from recognition. These men, these black soldiers her empire had called beasts, were singing the same song she'd just sung. Different words, different melody, but the same heart, the same longing for home, the same faith that something beyond this suffering existed, the same defiant insistence on remaining human. When the gospel hymn ended, Sergeant Carter looked across the compound. His eyes met Keiko's. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that moment, they weren't prisoner and guard, American and Japanese, black and Asian. They were simply people who understood what it meant to survive through song, to carry culture like a candle through the dark, to refuse to let the world's cruelty kill what was beautiful inside them. "Thank you," Keiko said in English, her pronunciation nearly perfect now. Carter nodded slowly. "Thank you," he replied. Music, they'd discovered, spoke a language propaganda could never touch. August 15th brought the news. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Within 2 weeks, repatriation orders arrived. The women would return home to a country they no longer fully recognized, and that might not recognize them either. They'd been changed by truth, by kindness, by the collision of propaganda and reality. On the morning of departure, the 25 women stood in formation one last time, their small bags packed. Sergeant Carter and his men stood across from them in the compound, where months ago everything had begun with nervous laughter and whispered jokes. How young we were, Keiko thought. How afraid. She stepped forward, and without a word bowed deeply, the formal bow reserved for honored teachers and respected elders. Behind her, the other women followed, bending at the waist, holding the position longer than protocol required. Some were crying. Yuki, Sachiko, even Michiko, who'd held herself so rigid for so long. "Arigato gozaimasu," Keiko said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for showing us what strength truly means." The interpreter translated, but Carter had already understood. He stood motionless for a moment, then did something that made Private Johnson's breath catch. He saluted. A full, formal military salute, the kind given to officers, to equals, to those worthy of respect. Not to prisoners, never to prisoners. But Sergeant Elijah Carter saluted anyway. Behind him, one by one, his men followed. Johnson, Hayes. Every guard who'd served at the camp raised their hands in tribute. The women straightened, tears streaming freely now. In their world, in their war, prisoners were invisible, shameful. Less than nothing. But these men saw them, had always seen them. As the truck pulled away, Keiko looked back one last time. Carter stood at attention, still saluting, until they disappeared from view. She'd arrived expecting monsters and found men. She'd come as an enemy and left as someone worthy of a soldier's final honor. The war had ended, but the lesson would last forever. 23 years later, Keiko Tanaka stood on a tree-lined street in Oakland, California, her heart pounding with the same nervous energy she'd felt stepping off that truck in Honolulu. She was 51 now, a schoolteacher in Tokyo who specialized in English language instruction. Her students often asked why she spoke with such care, such reverence, when teaching them American phrases. She never quite knew how to explain that every English word she spoke was a small act of defiance against the lies she'd once believed. The house before her was modest, a craftsman bungalow with a well-tended garden. She'd written ahead, uncertain if the letter would even reach him, if he'd remember, if he'd want to see her. The door opened before she could knock. Elijah Carter stood in the doorway, grayer now, his shoulders slightly stooped with age, but his eyes still held that same quiet dignity. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, former guard and former prisoner, separated by an ocean and 2 decades, but connected by something that had never faded. "Miss Tanaka," he said softly, "you came." She bowed deeply, the formal bow she'd given him that last morning. "Sergeant Carter, I came." Inside, his wife Ruth had prepared tea. Their 3 children, grown now, gathered around the dining table with curious, welcoming faces. Photos lined the walls. Carter in uniform, the family at church, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. A life lived, a future built. "I've been teaching for 18 years now," Keiko said, her English still careful but confident. "I teach my students about the war, about propaganda, about—" She paused, searching for words. "About the summer I learned what strength truly means." Carter's youngest daughter, Angela, leaned forward. "What did my father teach you?" Keiko looked at Carter, who remained characteristically quiet, letting her speak. "Your father showed me that the strongest people aren't those who have power over others," she said. "They're the ones who have every reason to be cruel but choose kindness instead. The ones who fight 2 wars, one against an enemy, another against their own country's injustice, and still refuse to become what the world tries to make them." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph, the only one taken at the camp, showing the women and guards at the impromptu singing evening. Carter stood in the background, his face serious but not unkind. "I keep this in my classroom," Keiko continued. "When my students ask about the war, I tell them, the real victory wasn't who won the battles. It was people like your father, who won something harder, the battle to stay human when the world wanted him to be a monster." Ruth reached across the table and squeezed Keiko's hand. Carter cleared his throat, his eyes glistening. "You gave me something too, Miss Tanaka," he said quietly. "You and the other women. You reminded me why we fought. Not to hate, but to prove that dignity and compassion could survive anything, even war." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, they shared tea and stories, laughter and memories. 2 people who'd met as enemies, separated by language and propaganda and war, now sitting together as friends who'd learned the hardest lesson: that humanity is always a choice, and choosing it, especially when it costs you something, is the truest form of strength. Later, as Keiko prepared to leave, Carter walked her to the door. She turned to face him one final time. "That day we arrived," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "when we joked that you were all bigger than our men." Carter raised an eyebrow, remembering. "We were right," Keiko said, "but not in the way we meant. You were bigger in every way that mattered." She bowed once more. He saluted, just as he had in 1945, and in that gesture, repeated across the decades, the story found its truest ending. Not in victory or defeat, but in the quiet triumph of 2 people who'd refused to let hate have the final word.